Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmageti Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Prayer as a spiritual practice. No matter which way we do or practice our spirituality, in most cases, prayer forms a part of it in some one form or another. Prayer is basically a form of asking, and that is something we have been familiar with almost as far as back we can go as we can remember. Because when we were little babies, all of us are babies once, in case you have forgotten, and there was a time when we were just a few days or weeks old. We needed things. We didn't know any words, didn't know any language. And so the only language we knew was that of crying. And so when the little babies feel hungry or if they want anything, they just cry. And oftentimes, mothers somehow seem to understand that language of the babies, and they know exactly. If it's crying now, means the baby is hungry. If it's crying now, means the baby is in pain. The mothers somehow understand it. It's some kind of a secret language between the baby and her mother. But soon, as we grow older, we are able to manipulate sound into words and ideas, and are able to ask in a more discerned way. And we usually ask for things that we need from people who can give them to us. And oftentimes when we are very young, it's usually the elders in the family, our parents, and they are the ones we go and ask whatever we need. But again, as we keep growing, we realize that while we know whom to ask for the things, certain things we need, we can approach the right sources in life who can give us what we want. But we also realize that there are situations, there are times when no human help, no help from the world, so to speak, can be enough, not adequate. And that's when we say, is there any superhuman source who can give us what human beings cannot do? And in religious and spiritual terms, that superhuman source usually is what we just call by the generic name God. And so asking for things from this transcendent supreme being takes the form of prayer. Oftentimes, the three ways spiritual practice gets cataloged, if you like, or categorized, is in a form of prayer, worship, and meditation. And sometimes people see them in a kind of a chronological order, that the first, the natural form of our connection with the divine occurs through asking what we need. And there are lots of things we need. And when we get what we ask for, then the heart is filled with gratitude, it deepens our faith, and then that offering that we do with a heart filled with gratitude, that oftentimes takes the form of worship or puja. That's why puja or worship is when we make all the offerings. And so there is this prayer when we ask something from God, and the fulfillment of the prayer is a kind of a movement from the divine towards us. Worship is a kind of offering we make to the divine. So it's a movement from the devotee to the divine. So these two movements, prayer, God giving things to the devotee, worship, the devotee offering things to the divine, these two movements bring the two closer to each other. And that is when meditation as a practice becomes real. I say real because meditation has become kind of a buzzword. It's kind of anybody who has anything to do with spirituality, they say, well, I meditate in the morning and evening. And so sometimes what happens is people begin to reduce spirituality to just meditation. And it depends on what we understand by the term meditation and what we do. Because meditation, in the truest sense of the term, is a fairly advanced practice. It's more than just simply sitting with closed eyes and paying attention to one's breath. And in order to be fit for meditation as a real practice, then we need to prepare our minds for that practice. And prayer and worship are the good preparations for that. So only when the mind kind of gets a little bit more disciplined, more focused through the practice of prayer and worship, then meditation becomes a life-transforming experience. The Vedas are, and as we have seen on many earlier occasions, Vedas is simply actually a big treasury of the wisdom that was revealed in ancient times to these great sages. Vedas were not, when they were revealed, were not obviously books. They were just the revelations that occurred, and these insights, these revelations that occurred were passed on from one generation to the next orally. At least at some point in those prehistoric times, when they just put it down, maybe on parchment or wherever they first wrote it down. And the paper and printing came relatively recently, just probably 5 or 6 centuries ago. So in whichever form these documents were written down in these old times, at some point, this is a great teacher called Vyasa, he then compiled all these texts together and kind of rearranged them in some form of system. And that took the form of 4 books. And that is why today we say there are 4 Vedas. We often refer to the Vedas in the plural, referring to these 4 texts in which that wisdom was compiled and put together. Now each of these 4 books is also subdivided into 4 sections. And just to have a broad idea about what those sections are, the first section of the Vedas are called the Samhitas. The second section is called the Brahmana. The third section is called the Aranyaka. And the fourth and the last section are the Upanishads. So the first section, Samhita, contains just nothing but prayers. All kinds of prayers, full with prayers and hymns. The second section, called the Brahmana, contains all the methods of worship, how to do the different yajnas, the Vedic forms of worship. The third section, called the Aranyaka, which literally means in the forest, was the same worship that was taught in the second section of how to do that internally, internalizing that worship. That's what mental worship it is called. So it's a form of meditation, but the same worship done externally through a ritual can be done internally in the heart. And when all these 3 were done, and then you come to the last section called the Upanishads, which contain the essence of the wisdom, the philosophy behind it. And therefore, even the division of the Vedas matches with these three things. Beginning starts with prayer, the middle is the worship, then as the meditation, and finally is that experience, that ultimate experience that comes as a result of these practices. Therefore, the first lesson a student was given when a student approached the teachers to learn, no schools like the schools we have today. So they had to go to the teacher's home and almost live there as a part of the family for several years to get the lessons. And so the first lesson that was taught to students in the Vedic period was this most ancient of prayers, which is pretty well known. It's called the Gayatri prayer. It just goes like this: Om Bhur Bhuvaswaha Tatsavitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yonaf Prachodaya. Simple translation, it would mean, Om, we meditate upon the adorable effulgence of the divine sun. The sun is seen as a symbol of it's the brightest object known to us human beings. It's a symbol of the supreme reality who pervades the earth, sky, and heavens. May that reality guide our understanding. Om. So this last section of that Gayatri prayer, Dhiyo Yonaf Prachodaya, that Dhi, it comes from the same root when we speak about the Buddhi, the intellect. And so this prayer was taught first because this prayer is primarily to open the potentiality of the intellect that we have. So yes, every one of us has that faculty to learn, to grasp, but the doors are not opened yet, so to speak. So, and that is what makes a difference between one person and another person. How much of the buddhi has opened up? How much of that potentiality is now available to us? And so this prayer is really a prayer that may my ability to grasp, my ability to understand be opened up fully, so that when I undertake study, I not only understand it just superficially, but the very essence of that. Because clearly the most superficial form of literature is really the newspaper. Or nowadays, I don't know how many people read the newspaper or whatever news website that you see. Once you kind of read the news, unless you're like forgetful or something, you don't again go there, because once you get the news, that's it. You don't need to read it again and again. But when you look at these ancient texts, the text which we refer to as scriptures, it's not enough to just read it once and say, okay, now I know what it is. Some people do that. But then, if anything, we might have the most superficial understanding of it. All of these texts have layers of meaning. And what we can get out of a text will depend on how much of my buddhi is opened up. And so the more I keep on awakening my inner understanding, and I keep on reading the same text over and over again, I begin to see a meaning in it that was not available to me in the beginning. And that is why this prayer was taught among the first prayers that was taught in the Vedic period. Now, if prayer has to become a real practice in our life, then there are certain requirements, certain absolute essentials, if you like. Because prayer can sometimes become just a periodic ritual that we do. Sometimes people do prayer in the morning or before meals or evening or night. But if the prayer is not to remain simply doing something which kind of makes us feel good or makes us feel less guilty, that's a very superficial benefit of a prayer. But if prayer has to become a real spiritual practice, then there are at least three things necessary. See, we said prayer is a form of asking from God. So the first requirement is God should be real for us. God not simply as an idea, not simply as a hope, but God is real. Because how can you ask anything from a fictitious being? It just wouldn't be real. You wouldn't even, it'll be a joke. So if I'm praying and if my prayer has to be a real prayer, then I must know that the one whom I'm asking is a real being. At least as real as the world in which we live. But as we will discover that God is even more real than this world. We know there are degrees of reality. But when we go to sleep and dream, the dream appears as very real as long as we are dreaming. But when we wake up next morning, then, and even if we remember the dream, we're able to dismiss it. It's like, oh, it was just a dream. What in essence we are saying, we are not saying that, but what we mean when we dismiss a dream is that this world that I see when I'm awake is somehow more real than the dream I saw last night. So we do accept the degrees of reality. Yes, dream was real as long as I was seeing it, as long as I didn't know it was a dream. But when I wake up, I know that's less real or not real compared to this world which is real. So even logically we can understand that if this world is somehow more real than the dream that I saw, it's possible that there is something more real than this world that I see. And that something, that someone who is more real than this world is in general we speak about as God or the divine being. So the first requirement, God must be real to us. Even when we speak about us being believers, when we try to distinguish ourselves from being atheists or agnostics, we have to be a little bit clear about these things. We are believers only during the times when we are aware of God's presence. But as we know from our own lives, most of the time, most people, when we are busy dealing with things, how often do we even remember God? That's why that when we spoke a few weeks earlier about dotting the day or finding occasions to remember the divine. Because most of the time, God is not a part of our picture, our mental picture, as we go through our day's activities. We might like to think of ourselves as believers, but pretty much most of the time, our mental makeup is not that different from an atheist or an agnostic. Because if I'm truly believer, if God is real, then God would never go out of my field of awareness. By that I don't mean that, let me put it this way. When we go about our day's activities, we are not all the time thinking, this world is real, this world is real. We don't keep saying that. But it is there. It's that awareness that this world exists. I am in this world and I'm carrying out this. This is at the background of all of our thinking and doing. Now, is God at the background somewhere as I go through my day's activities? If not, then I'm kind of, depending on the percentage of time I remember God and I don't remember God, I'm kind of going back between being an atheist and a believer. Even for me to be a true believer is to have somewhere in the corner of my heart, the presence of the divine must always be there. And so that is what I mean by God being real. Oftentimes when we speak about God as being omnipresent, God is everywhere, God is infinite, God transcends time. Now these are not just words. And we need to take these descriptions or the way we understand divine, seriously, if God is everywhere, then there is no place where God is not. No matter where I am, no matter what time of the day or night, or which place I am on, God is present. And so it makes sense, therefore, to be aware of that reality in some form or another. So that's the first thing. God must be real to us. The second thing is this full faith that God listens to me. God hears when I pray, whether mentally or through words. God is listening. And a third requirement is God always responds to my prayer. Now, this third requirement, we probably could get a little skeptical about it, because it doesn't, many of our prayers just end up nowhere. Nothing happens. We keep on praying. So many prayers have been offered over the year for world peace, and that hasn't happened yet. And so, is God even listening to all these prayers for peace and reconciliation that are being offered in different parts of the world, individually or collectively? And so, it's possible to be skeptical about whether God listens to every prayer. But when we say God listens to prayer or God answers our prayers, what we often mean is God answers it with a yes, that I wanted something, I get it. Then that means God has heard my prayer. And as we have seen on the earlier occasion, that no, simply a yes answer is not simply the only way to answer a prayer. A no answer is also an answer. So every time we pray, God is saying either yes or no. And that no is not because God is upset with us or angry with us. That no can be as much an expression of God's love as yes. I think parents and grandparents understand it well, because sometimes when the youngsters in the family keep asking them, give me this, give me that, and usually they will not give everything. It depends on what is being asked. So if a parent or grandparent determines that this is not good for the child at this juncture of time, they will say no. They say no because they feel this is something that will not help you right now. So that no is also filled with love. And therefore, a devotee recognizes that God is real, God listens to my prayers, and God will say either a yes or a no. And both God's yes and God's no are both filled with love. In fact, at some point in life, we might look back at all the things we wanted from God and we be so grateful to God that God didn't give us everything we asked for. Because a lot of times we ourselves don't know what is really good for us. Sometimes only in retrospect we realize, oh, what stupid things I was asking for God then. But if that's what we are going to say a few years from now, we better to start thinking about it now itself. So although prayer is a form of asking, but when the prayer as a practice evolves and deepens, we recognize it is much more than simply asking. In fact, these divisions that I spoke about earlier, prayer, worship, meditation, they all seem to get merged in one. A prayer then cannot be distinguished from worship and cannot be distinguished from meditation. The main purpose of prayer as a spiritual practice is to attain moral purity and spiritual progress. Then the question, of course, is if prayer is a form of asking, what should we ask for? And people ask for all kinds of things. So it's possible to divide whatever we ask God for into at least two separate buckets. One is everything that will make us happy and free from pain in this world. And since we realize sooner or later we are not here forever, that we'll be here for the next few years. Nobody knows what that few stands for. So it's good to even ask God for something even beyond this world. So that's what the two buckets were. One is to make us happy and free from pain in this world, and make us happy and free from pain even beyond. Sooner or later, again, we also see, if anybody kept note about the different ways we prayed at different stages in our life, we see that our prayers change. What we ask for and how we ask for it changes. Changes with age, changes with circumstances, changes with many different factors. So our prayers, and that's why, while those people who have difficulty formulating their own prayers might use some set prayers, and there are some amazing prayers. So there are books containing these prayers, and it's possible to kind of take help of those books. But if it's a form of asking, and if I know what I need, then if the prayer that comes from the heart doesn't really need any books, this is what I need, and I should be able to express it in any way. It doesn't have to be grammatically correct. God understands perfectly well in whichever way, whichever language we speak. All languages God understands, because everything really comes from God. So whichever way we ask for, the prayer does get answered, but as we change, we find our prayers changing, and then the kind of things we asked for when we were little, when we were teenagers, when we were in different stages of life, these things change. The example that the story that Sri Ramakrishna sometimes told is of that at some point we recognize that asking God for these little things seems a little foolish when God can give us much more. And Sri Ramakrishna says it's almost like going in the presence of a great emperor, and then emperor says, ask whatever you want. And that time, all that I was just on my way to my grocery store, and all I was looking for a few eggplants to get. And when the emperor says, what do you want? He said, can you just use 2 pounds or 5 pounds of eggplant? And of course, an emperor can give that to me. But if I know in whose presence I'm standing, an emperor can give me a lot more. Then it seems so foolish to ask for just some eggplants. Eggplants was the example Ramakrishna uses, but really we can substitute it by anything that we want. And so when we recognize the immensity of the divine and the power of the divine, then sometimes we realize how petty it is. It's like, God, I've got a headache. Could you just make my headache okay? It's not wrong to ask God for that. But if you're just one Tylenol can do the job, then better to ask for something more from God about that. One other thing that we see is that in the beginning, a prayer might seem like a monologue, that I'm doing all the talking, I'm doing all the asking, and there doesn't seem to be any response from the other side. It's almost like you pick up a phone and start speaking with your friend, and you're the one doing all the talking. At the very least, you want your friend to be on the other side of the line, make some sound. Otherwise, you begin to even doubt whether, are you there? Are you there? You keep on asking. So when we pray, we don't hear anything back. And that's why faith comes in, that even if I may not hear anything back, that God is still listening. But when we pray with faith, with sincerity, when prayer becomes a deep practice, then it no more remains a monologue. It becomes a kind of dialogue with God. One other thing to remember, I said prayer is a form of asking, but sometimes people have resisted this idea of asking, saying, I just don't like to beg from anyone. Prayer is not begging. It's like when we know someone is sometime. I mean, I don't know how it gets seen in every part of the world, but at least in the where I was growing up, when any of us, when you go and ask something from our parents, we don't feel we are begging from our parents, no, because our parents are very own. When we were little, when you are little babies, where else shall we go if we want something than to the elders in our family? Then it's not like I'm begging for it. Although the word begging can be used in many different contexts, but we don't see ourselves as beggars. And so similarly, if God is our very own, then asking something from God is not a form of begging. In fact, when we tend to see it as begging, it's more a reflection of our egoism and our ignorance. That, oh, how can I um, demean myself by asking? It's just ego there. And so it's good to not mistake praying as a kind of begging. One other question that can come with regard to prayer is, who answers our prayers? And it's a big question, it's a big philosophical question. And yes, I'm praying to God, so of course God answers my prayers. But then you just kind of go into like, but where is God? Is my prayer being answered from somewhere up above, which is how normally human beings tend to look up heavenward as if heaven is upstairs? But that's what we tend to do. So, is my prayer being answered by outside from somewhere, or is my prayer being answered from within? Because we also tend to see divine as dwelling in our own heart. And clearly, it's not that difficult to figure out that the divine who is within or divine who is outside are not two different divines. That God is one. Whether one likes to see God as outside or above in the heavens or deep inside our heart, it's not two different gods. It's not as if God is not there but God is here, or God is not here but there. God is everywhere. If God is everywhere, God is as much here as there. And whichever way we might like to think of God, whether the prayer is answered from within or from without, a pragmatic approach would be, does it matter? I wanted something and I get it. It doesn't matter whether the response came from here or from somewhere else. What we do know is that this is not simply a theoretical formulation, because prayer is not a kind of a new modern practice. It has been around for centuries. People in all parts of the world throughout history have prayed, and they have experienced that the responses to their prayer. So we know that as a practice, it actually works. The practice of japa, mantra repetition that we do, is itself a form of prayer. In fact, most mantras are really a short prayer, that's all. And so, whichever way we might like to think the practice of japa, a japa can be done as a form of worship, it can be done as a form of meditation, it can be done as a form of prayer. So, a mantra, usually mantras tend to be short. And it's the shortest prayer. Among the shortest prayer is the mantra that we repeat every day. Or prayer can be done without using any words at all. And that's what generally people like to think of meditation as, when no specific words are used, but one is kind of in the presence of the divine. One other distinction we can make between prayer, worship, and meditation is both prayer and worship, at least in the beginning, is something that we have to do. When we ask, there has to be some sense of I asking the divine. or when I'm doing puja, I'm making this offering. So that I exists in the beginning. But both prayer and worship, when we get immersed in those practices, that I somehow disappears. So when we begin prayer, yes, of course I'm praying and this is what I want. But in that depth of that prayer, that I disappears. It's not like every moment I'm praying. If that I becomes too prominent, then God goes out of the picture. Similarly, puja as well. In the beginning, yes, there is a one who is doing worship, there is the altar, there is the divine. So there is a seeming duality there in the beginning. But very quickly we see that the sense of I kind of goes at the background, and then the divine alone remains. So to distinguish meditation in its deepest form from prayer and worship is simply this, that the sense of I exists in the initial stages of prayer and worship, but meditation as a state of being is actually something that happens. Prayer is something we have to do, worship is something we have to do, and although we speak about doing meditation, what we are really saying is I'm trying to do things to make my mind fit for the state of meditation. Because in reality, meditation cannot be done. In reality, meditation is something that happens. So meditation is a state of being, not so much an activity. A prayer is an activity, a worship is an activity, and meditation is just being. It's a little bit like, we don't generally think of sleep as an activity because we're not really doing anything in sleep. We're just lying there. So although we say, oh, now I'm going to sleep, as if I'm going to do something, but sleep cannot be done. What can be done is I can go to my room, find a comfortable bed, switch off the light, lie down, and just wait. There is nothing. You cannot do sleep. When sleep comes is not in my hands. I can create an environment which might help for the arrival of sleep, but that's all I can do. That's the doing part. And then the sleep happens. Depending on how much prarabdha I have, good prarabdha, you'll fall into sleep earlier than otherwise. So that's one other distinction to keep in mind. Prayer is something that we can do, worship is something we can do, meditation is something that happens. That's why I've said that sometimes people who want to be accurate with their language don't even speak that I'm now going to do meditation. What they sometimes say is, I'm not just going to go and sit in the shrine. I'm just going to sit and think of God. Because thinking is something we can do. Sitting is something we can do. But meditation is something that happens when I'm able to do these things correctly. Finally, what are the benefits of prayer? Why should I pray? How should I pray? So prayer's benefits are, first, it reduces the inner resistance of the ego. Because any form of asking is because sometimes the ego is, as I said in the beginning, people think of it as begging and then they don't want to do it. But prayer is actually trying to get the ego out of the way and be in the presence of the divine. It also, prayer removes fear and insecurity. A lot of fear in our lives, a lot of sense of insecurity comes because we feel, oh, it's just me and the rest of the world. And these immense powers and forces out into the world were just way more powerful than I am, that there is nothing I can do by myself. That's at the source of all fear, different kinds of fears and insecurity that we experience. But a devotee for whom God has become real, a devotee says, I'm never alone. I'm never helpless because God is there. God, my own, someone who is my own. And depending on, the way we relate to God can vary from person to person. For some, God might be a very fatherly presence or a motherly presence, or God is the dearest friend. God is the soul of my soul. There are any number of ways that relationship can occur. It's not an intellectual process. It's not like we just sit down and say, okay, today I'm going to decide how I should look upon God. It doesn't happen that way. It just happens naturally. That God is my own, and to different people, God might, that sense of being own can manifest in many different ways. But when God becomes a real presence, then fear and insecurity will go. Swami Ramakrishna Vedanta, a great disciple of Ramakrishna, once said that the fear, the presence of stress and fear and anxiety in our lives is an indication that our faith in God has not become firm yet. It's still a bit shaky. Because how can I be afraid of anything? How can I be stressed out by anything if I know that I'm being held by my hand by the divine? That's what, when we were little and we are holding the hands of these elders in our family, whether it's our parents, our father, our mother, a baby fears nothing. For all we know, that mother must be scared about everything. But to a little baby, my mother is all in all. And that's what the devotee says. That if I'm aware of God's presence all the time, then this fear and anxiety, I have to say goodbye to it. And so whenever we feel helpless, whenever we feel afraid, whenever we feel stressed, we have to remind ourselves, I'm forgetting that God is here. And so that's what I mentioned earlier about people who proclaim they are atheists and people who don't say that publicly, but in effect are atheists every time we kind of deny the presence of God in our lives. And the third thing prayer can do is it withdraws our mind from all distractions. In yoga and in Vedanta as well, there is one of the practices called pratyahara, that every time the mind and the body kind of get distracted by something, to withdraw it, to bring it back. And prayer does that well. When we are praying with faith, with concentration, it's very difficult to be distracted at the same time. So it does remove distractions from our life. It also, prayer, when it comes from the heart, it stimulates the heart, what the books often refer to as the heart center. And we have seen this before, so I'll just only mention it, that oftentimes it is said that we should pray for the divine in our heart. And that's not the biological heart. That's also not the emotional heart, because the heart is also, we use the same word to speak about it as the seat of emotions. And then, of course, there is the spiritual heart, where we are expected to meditate. So in a way, we have like three hearts: the physical heart, the emotional heart, and then the spiritual heart. And so it stimulates that spiritual heart. And that's why I said, even for a good practice of meditation, it has to be preceded by a practice of prayer, because it's prayer that awakens that heart center. And then it becomes easier to visualize the presence of one's Ishta, one's chosen deity in the heart. So any practice, if it begins with prayer, that can be, and again, prayer not as a ritual, not as one of the steps to be completed, a prayer that comes from the heart, prayer that acknowledges the presence of the divine within us and outside us. And finally, prayer can keep us alert, help us remain alert. Sometimes in our so-called practice of meditation, people oftentimes fall asleep because meditation is just being in the presence of God, and God is this embodiment of consciousness, of awareness. And so, if meditation kind of results in sleep, then there's something wrong there. But prayer, since it is some doing, unless one is like dead tired, if you're on a treadmill, you generally won't fall asleep. But if you're lying in your bed, it's easier to fall asleep. But in a treadmill, you know that if you take a wrong step, if you become unconscious, you might just stumble and fall and hurt yourself. And prayer is almost like some spiritual treadmill, if you like. So it generally keeps us alert. It will be difficult to fall asleep while praying, again, unless one is like extremely tired. And finally, prayer can help us transcend our limitations and become illumined. Prayer itself, at that stage, goes beyond the distinction between prayer, worship, and meditation. That all these practices merge into one. No matter what we call that practice, it means it's dwelling in the presence of the divine, feeling the presence of God inside us, outside us, above, below, everywhere. And that's essentially what a devotee seeks. That's essentially what spiritual life really means. It's more than simply reading a bunch of books or attending lectures or observing a few festivals. All of these things are helpful to the extent I become progressively aware in my life that God is a real presence, that I'm never without the presence of God. It will help remove a lot of these challenges we have in our life, in our personal lives, and therefore practice the prayer as a spiritual practice can be deeply beneficial and deeply relevant to all of us. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu.